Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I wanted to share with you how we can work on our drawing skills using stencils. It's still the month of Inktober, and so for us who maybe aren't as comfortable with drawing our own images, I want to show you how you can start with a stencil and how you can use it to just add other images and other doodles to improve your drawing practice. So let's get started. So the first step in this project is to add some ink onto your project. And when we're adding ink, I'm choosing some distress inks from Holtz. I have the little mini domed ink applicators as well as the flat ones. I'm going to show you how you can use both on this. And I'm just going to start by adding a little bit of color to my background. So in this case, I'm going to start with the picked raspberry. And with these domed ones, it's supposed to give you less edges as you work. I think the key with this one though is to realize that you're going to always have a little bit more ink in the center. So if you are concerned about getting a more even blend, just be very gentle when you put your first little bit down. Because when I first started using these, I did that. And you're going, oh, okay, that's really bright. And then it's hard to get rid of that really strong line there. So something to be said about making sure you go very gentle when you're just adding that color on. Especially with the domed part, because if you press too hard, you end up with spots all the way along your piece of paper. But if you're using the flat ones, the key with the flat ones is, again, making sure that you go on a little bit more gently, because you can also get really harsh lines along the edges. I'm being better than I usually am today with this, but it is something that can be a struggle. Because like right there, you can see a little bit more of a line. And that's where the domed ones definitely have an advantage. But both of them take a little bit of working on just to figure out how to use them in a way that really works on the project and where you can end up with a really even blend. So with everything, it's just a little bit of practice. Again, flat line. So need to blend a little bit more just to try to get rid of that. And so blending just takes a little bit of practice, kind of like any art technique. And now I'm going to go in with a little bit of a darker blue color. So I think I'm going to start with Salty Ocean. That's more of that ocean blue color. It's a little bit lighter. I kind of want to start with a little bit of a lighter tone in here. I'll probably add in a little bit of the blueprint sketch as well. It's nice to actually have lighter and darker areas on your tags. And I love mixing these colors together. Because you add it to areas like this that already have quite a bit of color, and you end up with that deeper hue. I'm just going to add in a little bit of blueprint sketch as well. That gives you that deeper color in there as well. So now that we have our inking on our tag, the next thing you want to do is choose a stencil. In this case, I'm choosing one with large holes. It's really important that you think about, do you want like a stencil with larger areas or smaller areas? Because ones like this are very small, so they're not going to have a lot of ink in those places. Well, this one's going to have a much larger open feel to them. So something to think about when you're choosing your stencils, about what kind of look you want. This is the Disjointed stencil from Well Whisper Designs. And I like what I have going on here, but I do want a little bit of subtle difference. And so what I'm going to do is start adding a little bit of Speckled Egg Distress Oxide ink. So instead of just using the straight Distress inks, like these ones, I'm going to be using Distress Oxide inks, which have a completely different property. So they're going to react a little bit differently to this. And I love the color, so I don't want to remove all of it, but I do want to maybe mute it a little bit. And so this is where adding this Distress Oxide on top helps build that contrast. And this stencil is a very hard one because it's so open that it does move a lot as you ink. So you almost need to blot and then mix a little bit. Blot and then mix. It is a little bit harder to add color through. And I think the idea is with this one is usually most people just spray through these, but I really love the idea of mixing the ink on them. So I'm just going to very carefully add it through. So you have to be a little bit more gentle in your movements. And so you can see now when you lift it up, that speckled egg adds variation. So now you can see all of the outlines from that stencil, but instead of being really insanely contrasting, and instead that's that nice light feeling of extra color on it. That's why I love the speckled egg color. It works really well for very subtle techniques. I've actually used this on a few different projects that I've shown here on my channel. I hit this with a little bit of heat just to make sure that the ink is fully dry. And now that it is, I love the texture. I love how this looks, but I want to start pulling out certain things out of this design. So in this case, I'm going to put the stencil back on top. And this is where you need to pay attention so you can figure out where your stencil was in the first place. And so now I'm going to go in with my Posca white paint pen. And I'm going to just start outlining some of these areas. And this is where the fun begins, because now we're talking about adding some of our own pen marks and adding our own doodling into our design. So you want to make sure you hold it down well, because you don't want it to go wander at all. Sometimes we want to add a little bit more than just inking, and we want the design to stick out a little bit more. And this is where using paint pens, and you could also use a jelly pen for this. I just chose a paint pen just because I've been really enjoying these Posca paint pens. They've been working very well in some of my journal pages, and I just like the final result of them. So I've just started adding them where I can and had making excuses to use them in my pieces. And you just want to go in and just, you don't have to outline everything. You can just outline areas. You can leave some areas open, some areas not outlined. You don't have to necessarily do the whole thing. So as you can see, I've actually left some areas in here not inked and some areas down there not inked. And so now what you want to do is to start filling in where you'd like with just different designs. And this is where you can take something that would be just generally just a stencil and make it a little bit more defined. That stencil moved a little bit as I worked, so I'm just going to clean up a couple lines here. And then just start adding any sort of mark making that you see, you think you'd like to have on your tag. So in this case, I'm starting with little swirlies. And this is a way you can just start adding your own drawing and your own patterns and your own doodling to your pages. What's nice about it is you already have your outline. You have the shape that you've been working in. And this is why you want to use a large stencil, because these larger stencils give you the space to start adding patterns and start adding your own marks to your projects. And I think the hard thing sometimes is when you're learning how to draw, it can feel really overwhelming about where to start. And so this was just a really fun exercise for being able to start adding a little bit of texture and pattern to your projects. Again, it's not hard, and what's great about it is you don't have to be an excellent drawer or understand perspective all that well. Doing swirls is actually quite easy. And it can be any mark. It doesn't have to be a swirl. It could be circles. It can be all sorts of shapes. And you'll see as I continue on that I'm going to be using a variety of shapes to add dimension. In this case, I'm just using dashes, sets of 3, and just doing them in whatever direction I feel like. I find this whole process quite meditative. It kind of forces you to slow down, and I know sometimes in my art I feel like, well, I need to rush through and get my page done, or I only have so much time for this. And what's nice about this one is this is something you could almost do anywhere. So I used to, before the pandemic, and I had to always be washing my hands all the time and hand sanitizing all the time, being careful what I touched, I used to always carry a notebook with me. So when I was sitting in a waiting room, instead of spending time on my phone, I usually pull out my notebook and sketch or draw. I also did a lot of patterns like this. And this is where, if you wanted to pre-prep some of the stuff, add your ink down to your journal page. Outline your stencil a bit, or don't even outline your stencil, do it freehand instead of using the stencil for it. And then when you're off in places where you need to kill a little bit of time, pull this out and do your doodles or do your little drawings. There's a lot of different ways you can try to build those creative habits just in those moments of your life. I used to, when I was working at a company that we were working online a lot, I would go into my meetings with usually a notebook so that I could draw as we talked. It was a way for me to stay concentrating on the tasks at hand. And I found that sometimes when meetings go on for quite a while, it can be hard to concentrate. So for me, the whole process of being able to draw really helped me actually focus more on the meetings and what we were supposed to talk about. And I think there's something important about just even taking the time just to be. And instead of being always so busy about the final result, it's taking the time just to draw and to come up with patterns and even think about like, well, what would I like to have as my next pattern? Oh, okay, I'm going to start doing like cross-hatching, you know, and this gives you a sense too of different patterns and techniques that you can use. And there's tons of patterns online from people who are doodling. And I'm not a Zentangle instructor, but I also know there's a lot of Zentangle patterns out there. I actually have a book that I like to reference occasionally with the great Zentangle patterns that are really easy to do. Now I'm just adding just little curvy lines. And with this one, you want to just try to follow the curve as much as you can on each line, that they're kind of a little bit more all the same. I'm just going to fast forward this just so that you can see a little bit quicker how I'm just adding a lot of the doodling to this page. And a lot of this is just patterns and random things that I'm either thinking up or I've seen in places, and I'm just kind of adding them in. And this is where you can have a lot of fun just researching different patterns and different ways you could start adding doodles and drawing with stencils onto your project. So this is first I want to take this tag. So you can see some areas I've actually just outlined but just not filled in. Other areas I have filled in and other ones I haven't outlined at all. So this way you end up with multiple textures. You have the texture that's just the inking. You have the texture that shows a little bit of the outline. You also have the textures that have all the textures and all the doodling on top. And so this is a great way of just getting really comfortable with your pens, getting comfortable with the idea of adding designs and other things onto your projects. So now that we've added all of our doodles, at this point we can decide to leave it as it is, or we can move on to another step. In this case, I'm going to leave this one as it is, but I did do another tag very similar to this one using the same colors, but you can see that just by blending a little bit different, you can get a very different effect. So for this one, I decided to use my Posca light blue marker just to do the outlining, and I added a combination of both the white and the light blue in my doodling. And now what I want to do with this one is maybe try looking at adding a few more things to it. In this case, you could draw on top of this, but today I'm just going to add a little bit of black ink and some stamped images. And so this particular stamp is part of Nicole Wright Designs Ledger and Script, and I'm just adding a little bit along the bottom. I'm also adding the other values. And I want to try to keep this a little bit lighter. I don't want to cover up all of the work that I've done, but I did want to mute it a little bit. I want to add some ink, but I didn't want to overwhelm all the patterns I've spent all this time putting on the back. I'm also going to be adding this Let Your Feet Wander, Let Your Eyes Marvel, and Your Soul Ignite stamp. This is from another one of Well Whisperer Design stamp sets. And I'm going to just add it right here. Give it a really good push. And what you might notice is that the paint pen underneath has almost resisted the ink in some places. If you don't like this look, if this bothers you, if you're not going to be happy with it, what you can do is just go in with your black paint pen and you can just go over those letters in places so that they show up a little bit better. Because Archival ink is great, but it will sometimes be resisted by the acrylic underneath it. And again, you don't have to do much, but just adding a little bit like that can just help that pop a little bit more. And I love this adventure stamp set, so I'm going to add in a few more images to this. This is where I have a little bit of fun with the stamps. So in this case, I'm going to add in the mountains. And I'm going to add in the bear. And sometimes the ink is in places you don't want it to be, so you can always just wipe it off with baby wipe. And that's a little hard to see, but again, this is where the pen comes in place. So I'm just going to come in with my paint pen. I'm going to add this guy back in. And this is why it's fun to play around with this, because you never know what you're going to get. Sometimes you'll stamp things and go, oh yeah, that's working really, really well. And then other times you're like, oh, well, that's resisting the surface a little bit more. And so this is where having paint pens and playing around with some of this stuff can be really fun, just to try to add a little bit of more understanding about how your products work and even just how you can use them together. And then if you have situations like this where it maybe doesn't work out quite according to your plan, that's not a problem. You can just go in, darken some things up, and off you go. If those mountains bother you, you can also go in and just add a little bit more. I don't mind the texture on them, but let's maybe just define them a bit more in places. And this is something to realize when you are using acrylic. Another option is you could just stamp this with acrylic paint instead of using ink, and then you probably won't have a lot of these issues because it will be a similar surface. I think I'll make this very contrasty. So I'm just going to be covering up a lot of the inking that's coming through. But again, that's a personal preference. For this tag, I do really want this to pop, but this is also where you could be adding interim layers where maybe you cut out something and put it on the top, and instead you could have a layer in here that has it resisting as well. Because even in here it is resisting a little bit. It's a little hard to see because the type is fairly fine, but there is some resist going on there. And because I do want this guy to stick out a little bit, I think I'm just going to use some of the blue paint pen. And I went a little bit funny with his foot here. So I'm just going to add in a little bit more. Try to get the right shape back. This is where you have to be a little bit careful not to go too crazy one way or the other so you don't change the look of your animal. But you can tell that's a bear, so that's good. So you can see by doing it two different ways, or by adding additional layers, you can go from something that is already really cool just on its own to adding a little bit more stamping or imagery to this. You could also have done this with a black paint pen, added your own doodles on top. I liked using the stamps. I thought that was kind of a fun way to just bring in this quote and add a little bit more contrast. I really love the idea of this. It's the idea that we can take something that we already have, like a stencil, and add to it. We can add our own doodles, we can get more comfortable with our pens. This is something very easily done in an art journal, and this is a way that you can really kind of extend what you already own and use it in a different way. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and maybe found something you can incorporate in your own creative practice. If you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. I would also love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment below, or you can also visit my website, hopalongstudio.com. There I have both the written instructions as well as photos for each of these video tutorials. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.